we're going to pick up where we left off last time and basically just keep building the site out. Now, I'll be honest, if you thought last session was complex, this is much more so. I will do my best to explain things as we go along, and I'll do my best to make things progress in an orderly fashion. But there are some CSS elements, primarily CSS, that still, even to this day, I haven't really even fully wrapped my own mind around it. I know enough to, when I run into problems, go find things, typically at W3 Schools or some other place, and say, oh, that's right, I forgot about that. Change the value and see how it works. So we're going to basically break some stuff, and I'm hoping that the breaking of stuff or the showing of things is going to be valuable training for you, because some of this stuff is honestly very, very hard to define just through words. And we'll even go take a look at the W3 Schools site, and even when you read it, you know, probably many of you are smarter than I, maybe you get it. I look at that sometimes and I go, man, that just didn't make sense to me. So if you've ever thought that yourself, you're not alone. I am frequently in the same boat along with you. Even to this point, there's some things that I still, just from a contextual standpoint, they just don't make sense until you start playing around with them and, okay, I get it. Or at least, even if you don't get it, you know where to go to make value changes to make things work the way that they're supposed to work and the way that you want them to work. So let me close or minimize that window so I can pay attention to what we're doing. This is, of course, the final product, the final page that we are going to end up with at the end of tonight's training session. And we've already previously laid out basically all the graphics and kind of the main container areas that are going to contain, and when I say containers, I'm talking about div areas, contain the content that we're about to add. We're going to build it piece by piece, because if we tried to add everything at once, I think this would become extremely overwhelming. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start back with this file, which we've previously given you, that's named index3.html. This brings up a point. Jerry, you told me that several people had asked, well, I don't understand. Why do you have multiple index pages? On a real working website, you would not have that. You would have an index page. The website server is only going to look for one index page by default. It's not that you couldn't have a page named index3, it's just probably not wise to do so. The reason why we've given you, index, I think I started with index 0, 1, 2, 3, was just that we built these in progression, just so you can kind of see the elements as they continue to build. And we're going to continue that tonight. We're going to start our first element in index 4, and we're going to proceed all the way through, I think, index 8. So here's basically what I mean. If I open up the folder that we've given you, let's see here, inside of the PSD slicing folder that we gave you with the source, in last part you have a folder called Site Part 1. And if you open up index 0, index 1, index 2, and index 3 in your browser, you don't have to upload them to your website. You can just double-click this and open up in your browser. You'll be able to see the HTML structure get built piece by piece by piece, and it basically follows along with the video training that we did in the last session. This session will be exactly the same, except for I'm repeating or starting with index 3, which is the blank page that we ended up with, and we'll just continue to build the HTML sections piece by piece, and then we'll talk about the CSS elements that are controlling basically the HTML content. So with that, let's jump over to the first new section. This is the file that you will get, the source file that you'll get, named index4.html. You'll notice up here in the very top header area, and if you remember from last session, the entire top section of this website, this web page, is basically coded as a division with an ID of header, the entire area. Then, because we knew that we've got this top section and we're going to have more content right below it, we broke that into two new divisions, header 1 and header 2. So the content that you're looking at here basically has been added via HTML to the header 1 division that is inside the main header div, which controls the entire area, including both header 1 and header 2. So let's jump over to Edit Plus, take a look at the HTML that was used to cause this content. My voice is already crackly. That's not good. We just started. Okay, we'll jump over to Edit Plus, take a look at the HTML that built the header 1 div, and then we'll take a look at the corresponding CSS and then just discuss it and show, basically how this layout is being accomplished. So let me open up Edit Plus. I've made the font type nice and big, so hopefully you can read this as best as is possible. See down here at the bottom, this is index 3. This is the one that we started off with. So in last session, basically, if I scroll up just a little bit, you'll see that we started with a div with an ID of wrapper, which again, I basically mentioned that we're not styling this with CSS whatsoever at this point. The ID of wrapper is basically just there as a placeholder in case we ever did want to style it. Underneath that is the div ID of header, which is what we just discussed. And inside of the header div is a div with an ID of header 1 and a div with an ID of header 2. And then this comment basically lets you know that the entire header div is being closed. So this is the section that we're working with. And by default, on the index3.html page that you got last time, you'll notice that there's no content in either div ID header 1 or div ID header 2. When we pop over to index 4, the one that we're working on tonight, you'll start seeing the new HTML that's been added. Okay, so if I highlight with my cursor this section, you'll see that this now is the content that's been added to div with an ID of header 1. You'll also notice down here that I have not yet added anything to div ID header 2, which is why that area is blank. So this is the entire bit of code right here that we're going to be discussing right this minute. Okay, so the new bit of code is that which comes between the opening and closing div tags for header 1. You'll notice that the first line is another div, so yet another container with a class this time, meaning that you can use it more than once, a class of content. Inside of that is yet another div with a class of mobile. Next comes a div with a class of contact info, which goes actually all the way down to here. And inside of that div are two spans. See a span with a class of phone and a span with a class of email. Now, if this sounds really confusing, I don't blame you, because like I said, this session we are basically dropping the training wheels and we're starting to run, and more than likely, in order for you to really get a strong hold of this, you're going to have to get the actual source files in your hand, and you're going to have to play around with them, just like I'm going to show you here, to really get this to sink in. It's again, I'll do my best, but I fully believe that probably a lot of you will be scratching your heads until you really get the files in your hands and basically get the ability to just play around with them and break them. And that's what I hope you do, because that's where the real learning comes in, is when you actually start to mess with it. So let's just talk about the CSS here, right? We need to look and see what are we doing to style the header? What are we doing to style the header 1 ID the content class that's inside of header 1, etc. Let's go take a look at this information. Over on the style.css file, I should have put this back to where it was. We have done our absolute best to organize the CSS file in conjunction with the training. So when you scroll down, I should put some space there. When you scroll down and look for the comment code right here, which says header, you'll know that the code that comes after that basically is dealing with the layout for the header area. So we first had a div with an ID of header. We covered this in the last session. The entire CSS that's controlling the ID of header is simply just a background color. We've told that particular area that we want to use this particular color to style the background for the header area. So if we pop over to the live site, looking again at index 4, this dark blue color, almost looks black, but this dark blue color that's coming right here at the top is being styled by that particular bit of CSS. And that's all that it's doing. Now, the next thing that comes down is, okay, we have the new div with an ID of header 1. Okay, let's see what's going on there, CSS-wise. We have a color property, and we are setting it to all Fs, which in hexadecimal, if you ever see all Fs or even just FFF, you know that is pure white. Again, it's kind of, I wish that in CSS they actually would call this text hyphen color, but what this is that the color style, the color property is setting the color for any text that's displayed in that particular area. So that's what this is doing. If there's any text to be displayed inside of the div with an ID of header 1, color it white. The next says, what size would you like the font to be? In this case, we have it set at 14 pixels. The next is a height value. We have height set at 50 pixels. What is this height value? This height value is the actual height of this area from the top of the browser down to the start of this background image that's beneath it. So if we wanted to grow this this area for whatever reason, client says, I don't want that, set at 50, I want it at 100. Changing the height value is going to cause that area to grow, and you can see how that works. And that's basically what I mean by playing around with things. Don't be afraid to mess around with things. Make a master copy of the style sheet and just start basically playing with values just to kind of see, what it's controlling. The more you do that, the more you will learn, the more you'll understand things from a deeper level, much more than you're going to get just by reading words on a page or listening to hear me speak. So that's what's happening by the div ID of header 1. Again, we're just setting the text to white. If I pop back over there, you'd notice that all the text in that area was white. The font size was set to a particular height, and the height of the header 1 area is set to 50 pixels. Now, underneath that in the HTML, if we look at index 4 again, the next thing that we have is this div with a class of content. So what are we asking it to do there? Well, we're setting a width for the content area of 970 pixels. We're also setting a margin. Basically, you can think of margin, both margin and padding as adding space. We're asking it to add no extra space to the top or bottom, and we're asking it to auto space left and right. Again, remembering if you have two values, the first value affects the top and bottom, and the second value affects the right and the left. So what we're doing with this is, because we have a finite width stated for this particular div, we are centering the content on the page. Since we've set a specific value for width, it knows how to auto space the left and the right because it can take my browser width, subtract the actual width I'm stating here, divide it by 2, and come up with the appropriate value for auto in the background. We're also adding padding of top. Again, you can think of padding and margin as adding space. They do it differently. One comes inside, one comes outside basically a particular area. And this is another thing that I think mostly you're going to have to play around with to really get a solid idea of whether to use margin or padding for something. It really just takes a feel for just playing around with things. But we're adding padding only to the top, in this case of 10 pixels. So let's just take a peek at just this statement and see what it's doing. So back to the live page. Since we've got a container area to the outside dimensions of this image that's roughly 970 pixels, the image actually is 978, this 970 pixel area is keeping this content basically in line with the top of this page, or very close to it. If I were to change that value to something strongly less, we'll just drop it by 100 pixels and watch what happens. We're going to see that that content is going to become narrower. If you look at it now, you can definitely see, if I were to grab my measure it tool and use that as basically a line guide, you can now see that there's lots of space between the mobile phone image and the outside part of this container. So that's what that value is controlling, is the overall width of this container, and it's centered because of the margin set to 0 auto. If we took away, if I put that back to 970, if I take away the margin value, if I use CSS comments to temporarily comment that out, again, / asterisk, asterisk, / if I save that, that margin value basically now is no longer allowing that content to be centered. So again, just play around with the document, watch things unfold. I think it's going to give you the best learning environment possible. The padding to the top, again, it's simply just giving us 10 pixels of space. It's basically pushing down the content 10 pixels from its normal space. And if I were to comment that out, you would see that whole content, the links and the images, they would all jump up. So I'll skip that, because if we go over every single thing line by line, we'll be here for weeks. Let's go back and take a look at the HTML again. I just want to make sure that we get a really good understanding that each one of these HTML elements basically is completely connected to the associated CSS. Again, someone asked last session, well, what's delivering the content? The content is being delivered via the HTML, and the styling and the positioning of the content, at least contextually, is happening via HTML. Some of the content image-wise is being delivered by CSS, but the CSS is primarily controlling the layout, the look and feel, the positioning of the HTML content. So the next is we have a div with a class of mobile. Inside of that, you'll notice that we have a link. We have the A tag. Again, remember that the A tag is the anchor tag. It is what you use to link either images or text. We have the href set, which typically would be the page name that you want the person to go to, or an actual URL if you wanted it to go off-site. You know, would start with http:// etc. In this case, like we've talked about before, for web development, frequently just the number sign, the pound sign, is used as a placeholder because it will make the link active, and the link can be updated at the end when you know exactly where you want it to go. So what's basically being told now is to link the words mobile site to something. That's what's happening here. So what's going on with the division with a class of mobile? Back to the CSS file. So the next is we have a class of mobile. Again, you know it's a class because of the period before the word mobile, that is also inside of a division with an ID of header1. So what this is saying is anytime you find anything styled as a class of mobile inside of the ID of header 1, this is what you're to do. We're setting a background image this time. We're actually using an image of the little cell phone. The image is contained at this particular URL, and again, this is how basically you make sure through CSS that you are attaching images properly to the background image property. So URL formed exactly like this, images, so it's in the images folder, and the actual file name is named mobile.png. It is a transparent PNG image, and again, remember that as far as transparency is concerned, PNGs are typically the best to use unless you really had a big audience that still were on IE6, which isn't likely. But IE6 did not handle PNG images well. It had all sorts of problems. Anything since then is fine with transparent PNGs. So if you're using a transparent image, typically you're going to want to use the PNG format. You can also use, if the image is very basic and simple, you can use the .gif or the GIF image, because that does support transparency. Just know that if you're ever trying to use a transparent image, you cannot use a JPEG, a .jpg image, because the JPEG format does not support basically transparent images. It'll put a white background around it. So the next thing is, remember that if you're using a background image through CSS, by default it wants to repeat the image horizontally and vertically in the X and Y axis. So we do not want that. We only want the mobile phone image to show up once. So we've set background repeat to a value of no repeat. Now, this next session or area basically gets complicated, and it's very hard. This is one of the first areas that we're going to run into that's very hard for me to define. Inline block. What is display to begin with? We're going to get back to this in just a minute. I'm going to skip it for now and come back to this in just a second. Also inside of this new div area that we're using, we're basically causing that mobile link to show up and the mobile phone image. We're also setting a height value. The height value of this area we determined based on the actual height of the image that we're using. So the little icons that we're using for the mobile icon, the phone image, and the email, they're 30 pixels in height. So that's just so you understand how we got to that height value. We based it off of the image height that were used as far as these icons. The padding left and padding top and this float left, that's interesting. That should have a semicolon at the end to be proper. Now add another layer of complexity to what we would think would be a really simple little piece of CSS. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. So let's play around with this. I will tell you that the display of inline block for this particular div does not have to be set. I could get rid of this, and this particular div would work fine. The ones below it would not. In order to just to keep things consistent, I added it to each, and I know that makes no sense right now, but you'll see, at least kind of get an understanding of things as we just kind of start playing with things. One thing that you need to know in regards to divs, we talked about this probably a couple of sessions ago, or HTML elements in general, really. There are block level elements and inline level elements. Most elements are really block level elements. So by that, all of your headings, everything from H1 through H6, those are all block level elements. Paragraph, the paragraph element is block level. Let's see, all div elements are block level. What's not block level, what is the opposite of that, or inline level, is the A tag. So all of your links by default are inline level. The span element is inline. The image element. Anytime you're adding an image is inline. But what does that really mean? Well, when you have, let's go take a look at, how do I explain this properly? Let's go take a look, let's jump ahead. Let's go to the final. We'll take a look at just content on the page. Okay, let's look at this. We have an H1 right here with the welcome to our website. Underneath it, we've got a paragraph element. Underneath that, we've got a paragraph element. But inside of this second paragraph is the image element. Okay, so let's back up just a second, because I'm hoping this is going to help this the display of either block or inline start to make a little more sense. Is this, like I said, all divs are block level elements. That basically means that their default characteristic is to have a line break above and beneath them, and to basically cause space above and beneath a block level element, and to force whatever comes next to a new line, basically a hard break after it, line break after it. This is why the text "Welcome to our website" that's wrapped in this H1 tag, this H1 element, which we know to be block level, instead of this next word lorem sitting up here on the same line with it, and we'll see that when we go to the live page. I'll jump over to the final. You'll see that we have "Welcome to our website" here, and then immediately there's a line break, and we have the next text that starts down here. Well, you'll notice that we didn't use the BR tag, the line break tag, in our HTML to force this to happen. It's happening because this is an H1 heading element, which we know to be block level. Again, what that means is it naturally puts space above and beneath it, and it forces a hard line break. Conversely, the A tag, the links, are inline, and here's an example of that. Right here, the word Cynthia Morgan that I'm highlighting is just regular text, as is the word on. But this hello world area is linked, and if I hover over it, you can see that it turns blue. You know that that's a link. Well, you'll notice that all of the text, both the linked text and the non-linked text, are all on one line. The words "hello world" were not forced to a new line underneath. This is because the A tag is an inline element. It stays in line with the rest of the surrounding content. It's the same thing with images. Images are another inline element. Now this might look like we caused a break and some space, but that's not really what's going on. If we go back and look at the HTML, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. We've got a new break, not because of the image, but because the image is wrapped in a new paragraph tag. If I were to temporarily get rid of this paragraph surrounding that image, well, actually it's not going to matter, because we've got a block level element above it, and it's saying to force that down. That's not a good example. We'll come up with another one as we go, but that one wouldn't have exactly worked the way I would have intended it to. However, this text right here that comes after the image element, you'll notice is on the same line with the image itself. If we go back to the site, you'll see that's the case. If the image were a block level element, this piece of text would actually have been forced somewhere down, to start down here. It would have started on a new line, etc. Because that's not the case, the text is basically flowing in and around the image as opposed to forcing it underneath. So you really need to understand what inline and block level elements are, and how they work and why they work differently, to try to understand what I'm about to show you. Let's go back to where we are. And I guess I have this temporarily messed up unless I put it back. Okay, so obviously all of this content is in one line, right? And we know that we have multiple divs inside of it. If we didn't set this to inline, these elements would start to try to stack vertically. So that's the first thing that you need to understand. And let's go back and just take a peek or cause that to kind of happen. I mentioned just a minute ago that this first display wasn't required. I can remove that and it wouldn't mess things up. But let's get rid of the second one, the one that's styling the next div for the phone. If I did not set anything for display, by default, because it is a div, it would be a block level element. So just temporarily commenting this line out and going back and viewing the page. Okay, not seeing the change that I expected. I do think that we had the image jump on us, but that's not it. Let's get rid of, actually, let's just change it to display block. We'll just force it. We'll force it to do its normal thing, and we'll put it back. All right, this is typically how a div is going to display one after another. Again, it's a block level element. This is obviously not what we want. We want it on one line. So typically you would see display, again, if it's not set for a block level element, it's going to be block. Sometimes, and you're going to see that when we get to the navigation of the site, basically the menu, in just a second, we're going to set that to inline. And basically what that says is ignore the normal order of things. I know that this is a div. I know that a div is typically a block level element. I want you to ignore it, and I want you to basically override its normal function and cause it to be an inline element, again, displaying it on one line as opposed to forcing those hard line breaks. Now, it gets more complex when you have this new call out of inline-block. What does that really mean? Well, I'd have to take you back over to the W3C and show you the different properties that you can set display to, and do my best to try to explain it. This is one of this is the first element that I'm going to be honest, I have a very hard time explaining verbally. You can see that there are many property values for the display property. So if you go to W3 Schools, one of the things that's easiest to do is you simply just type in the search box, just put the piece of CSS in the search box. And when I mean that, I don't mean necessarily like a value of 30 pixels. If you wanted to know, what's height, you could copy this, paste it in the search box, and it would lead you very quickly to an understanding of what that is. So on this page, it's giving us the property values for the display property, one of which is inline block. It says here, and I'm just reading their text, the element is placed in an inline element on the same line as adjacent content, but it behaves as a block level, as a block element. This is very confusing, but what it's basically saying is this. Again, understanding that block level elements have space above and beneath them, this is telling it to display it on one line, on the same line as adjacent content, but make it behave as a block level element or block element in every other way, and the only other thing that the block element does is that extra space top and bottom. So we go back to this page, and let me put the CSS back to the way we had it, which it is, back to inline block. We'll refresh. There is some additional spacing above and beneath each one of these items that's happening because of the inline block. And if you changed everything to inline, you would have everything on one line, but you would get rid of that spacing. The spacing would change. So let me see about that. And hopefully it operates the way I'm defining it to you so as to not make a liar out of me. Yeah, well, it's just the phone image. It's probably very hard to see, but that phone image just jumped higher. Let me put it back and see if there's a better way for me to show you this. Let's see. I don't know that switching this one will do anything different. It probably will just move the email icon, but we'll take a look at it. Yeah, you'll just notice that these icons are jumping out of place when they're sent to inline or inline block. Setting it to inline probably would have worked. I'm only using it basically to somewhat auto position the spacing above and beneath the icons, and that's probably the best I can really define that. You'll just have to play with it and know that if you find that all of a sudden you have elements that are stacking vertically on top of each other, and that's not what you intended them to show horizontally, that probably you need to change the display to something that includes inline, either just display inline by itself or just display inline block, or there's other inline table, etc. All of those values, you'll see inline block, and inline table all show up here in the table description, basically, that's showing up on W3 Schools. Another cool thing that you can do, just as a quick aside, to learn more, you'll see that sometimes on W3 Schools they've got this play it button, and it will basically dynamically show you kind of what's happening in regards to using these different property values, which is a great learning tool. In addition to that, there's also this try it yourself functionality. So for CSS display property, you can see that they've got a paragraph with a class of inline, and they've told the paragraph to display inline. Well, we've just discussed that paragraphs by default are not inline level elements, they are block level elements. And if you click the try it yourself button, you get basically this page. Take a look at the CSS and the HTML rather first, and notice that we have two distinct paragraphs, one that comes right after the other. If this was not set to display inline, this second paragraph would be on the second page. It would be exactly as it is by default. And if I get rid of, this is the cool thing with the W3 Schools website, is this dynamic. If I get rid of that bit of CSS and I click edit and click me, you'll see that they go back to the default characteristics. Adding it back in now would force it to show up as they're doing. So this is a really great learning tool, and I recommend that you go play around with it as much as possible. Let's see. Back to our page. So we've had a discussion of inline, and the reason why we're trying to get these block level elements to be on one line, and the fact that we're using inline block is just to kind of control the spacing above and beneath. Next is, well, how are these elements over here on the right hand side and this is on the left? How come we've got lines that show up whenever we hover over links and aren't there to begin with, if anything else? We know that all the text is white because we've already covered that through the CSS. But what about the other layout stuff? Well, let's go take a look. What we are doing, and let me scroll up just a little bit. Again, going back to the understanding, we're talking about the div with an ID of header 1. is we're outputting the image. The text, the link, is not coded obviously in the CSS file. It's coded right here in the actual HTML. That's causing the link to happen. It's the same thing for the other text that's on the page. The phone number and the email address is the same. That's being output from the HTML. It's the styling and layout that's coming from the CSS. So back to the CSS file. And we now have this new bit of CSS. We are telling it the header 1 area with a class of contact info, and basically the stuff, the content that is inside of the class of contact info is the phone image, the phone number, the email icon image, and the email address link. We're telling it to float to the right. This is the first time we've dealt at all with floating. Floating an element basically takes it out of its normal, what they call the flow of a document, and it tells it to do something else. Well, normally, by default, if we go back to the page, this information over here would sit just to the right of the text mobile site. It would be well over here. And if I take out that float, you can comment that out and watch it happen. We see exactly that. The way that we're forcing now this new div, because we have both of these pieces of content housed inside of another division, another container, we are forcing it to the right of our defined area. Again, we defined this area as 970 pixels in width, and we centered the margins. And now we're saying, hey, take this information and force it to the right. And how we're doing that is by using the float right rule. What is clear right, though? Clearing becomes a little more complex, but basically when you float elements, again, like I said, you're taking elements out of their normal flow. You're causing them to do something else. Until you basically turn that off, it will try to mess with everything that follows it. So the clear property is to say, look, I'm now finished with the changing of the flow. I no longer want to float to the right. I did float to the right, and now I don't want to do that anymore. And in this particular case, we're setting both the float rule and the clear rule inside of the same div ID. Frequently, this will not be the case, and we'll see that here in just a minute when we get to the next section of the document. So, but that's what's happening with that float right bit of CSS. We are getting back this division to be basically hard to the right. And if we were to add more content to say this email address, going back to, again, the HTML, which is where the content was added, and if I added more text to it, we're going to see that because of the float right, that right-hand side is going to stay in perfect position. It's going to start moving things to the left, but the float right value is keeping it hard to the right edge of the entire container, the entire div area, which we know that we styled at 970 pixels. So let's see. I think that's mostly what's happening in regards to the HTML. The only other things are these padding left and padding tops. You'll see that the padding top for each of these is set to 10 pixels. So let's go ahead and comment out one of those real quick and take a peek at what that value is changing. This is controlling the email. Let's see. And you'll see that that image now is jumping out of position. So the padding top is basically controlling the positioning of that email icon. The padding left now is controlling the positioning of the text in conjunction with the email. So the icon obviously takes up a certain amount of space, and if you start from the left and you move over, the space that's coming between the icon and the text is happening because of the padding left value. So for example, and it's based on, because the icon widths are not consistent. The heights are 30 pixels, but the widths are different, which is why you've got a padding left up here of 28 pixels, and over here you've got a padding left of 32, and this other was probably the same width. So if you want to just kind of see what's happening with the padding left, of course you can just change these values. Typically when you do change values, I recommend that you change them strongly. Don't just change them by a pixel or two, because it can be really hard to see what's going on if you do it that way. But we just changed the value for padding left in the email icon, and you'll now see that we have a lot more spacing that's happening between the icon and that bit of text, and that's what's being controlled via that padding left property and value. So I think that's it for the heading 1 area, and I look at this, I look at the time and go, wow, I can't believe I took that long to cover that one little bit. But that's really what it is. Does anybody have any questions on just this one div area? Does that hopefully mostly make sense?
Doesn't look like any questions. Oh, so the padding starts from the left side of the image?
Yes. In this case, it starts from the left side of the image. And I guess I should back up, because we've wrapped this entire thing in a span. Whenever you see span, you're basically telling it, to start doing something between the opening and the closing spans. So we're using a span class around the phone and around the email. Again, spans are inline level elements. They're not block level elements, which is why we're using them. Otherwise, we have to start setting more display stuff to override their default nature. But in this case, the positioning of the image is to the left of the span, and that padding is also starting to the left of the span. So we're having to figure out the width of the image and then increase it by whatever amount of extra space that we want. So if we just go over here real quickly, I could actually, if I right click and choose to view background image, we'll see just that image by itself. And if I hover the top browser window, you'll see that it tells me it's 30 by 24. Actually, this one isn't 30 pixels in height. Interesting. But it is 30 pixels wide. So since this image is 30 pixels in width, if you look at the CSS, we're basically saying give it an additional 2 pixels of space. If you thought that was a little tight and you wanted to go to 34, it's entirely up to you. You would just see that you would get just a little bit of extra space between them. You just want them to set, where they're nice, they look good, and of course, if you're like me, I'm a freak for symmetry, which is not always a good thing, but just kind of take a look at them and try to make the spacing between your icons and your text symmetrical if you're like me. Yeah, Jerry?
What's causing the space between the two contacts, between the phone area and the info?
Between this area and this area?
No, between those two.
Between these two? Okay.
Yeah.
That is being done by margin right. It's right here. So in the very first element that we're outputting is the phone icon and the phone number, and then to the right of that comes the email. So I've added margin right of 35 pixels to control the spacing between the end of the phone and the start of the email icon. So if I wanted that larger, I wanted that like incredibly larger, I was going to put 135. We'll do that to make it easy to put it back and at the same time see. We're going to see that now this element is floated, this whole area is floated to the right. So this area is going to stay hard right. It's not going to move. But we're going to see this phone area is going to move strongly to the left because I'm adding margin to the right of it. And you can see that. So if you wanted to move that positioning around, you thought that, maybe it was close to where you like it, but maybe not so much. You want just a little bit more space. I just set to 45 that time. So now there's just a little bit more space than there was initially. But yeah, that's being handled by the margin right. And again, one of the things that I would recommend that you do is to use CSS comments to do the technique that I've been showing you several times already, that they say or is defined as commenting out something. If you ever want to figure out kind of what's happening with something, simply / asterisk, go behind the actual rule, asterisk, and then /. You'll see if you're using Edit Plus, when I started this, everything turned green, and when I completed it, when it became proper, the only thing that's left green is just the area that I've commented out. Basically, I'm saying right at the moment, ignore this particular rule. And since I've got CSS comment code wrapped around the actual rule, it removes it temporarily so that I can see it. So now without any margin, we get this. We get a little space, but we don't get a whole lot. So you get a real good visual idea or understanding as to what each rule is doing by commenting them out one at a time. One thing that Jerry did mention in a previous session, which is good to remember, that you can't have CSS comments nested inside of CSS comments. So by that I mean, if you decided to comment this one out by doing what we just did, you can't also comment out this line starting up here. Oops, of course it would help if I typed it right, and try to also do it down here. You'll see that this one is not green anymore, it's black, and it's telling you that there's a problem with the way you're doing things. You can, however, comment out multiple lines at the same time, provided you're only using one. So let me talk about that for 2 seconds, and then we'll get off this and get on to the next block. So if I wanted to say, well, what's happening because of the margin right, the padding left, and the padding top, I could comment out all three of those at once by doing this. You see that I started the comment on this line, I've ended it on this line, and because there's only one, it all worked fine. And if we save that, we wanted to go see what was happening, we would get, weird, we got no space here, we got the phone icons moving out of position, and that's what's happening because of that removal. You can, however, remove, and this is the last thing I'll say on CSS commenting, at least for now, you can remove multiple lines individually. So, okay, well, I want to check out what happens when I remove margin right and padding top. You'll see that each comment is on its own individual line, and that will work just fine. You'll have the ability to see what's happening regarding just the removal of two elements. Typically, it makes most sense to remove them one at a time, especially when you're first learning, because if you start moving multiple elements or commenting out multiple rules at a time, you might be confused as to which is affecting which. So I'm guessing we're good then, Jerry? On to the next section.
Let me just check real quick, and yeah, we're okay.
Okay. So we'll go to index number 5. Let's take a look at it first. And we'll see that now the next thing that we're going to add is the logo, the tagline, and then the actual navigational menu. Again, the navigational menu, there's different ways to build them. Almost always the best way to build a navigational menu is inside of a list. In this case, an unordered list. Well, an unordered list is what you typically think of when you talk about a bulleted list. And if you think about reading bullets on a page, you know they typically are, obviously one on top of each other. That is, again, because the default characteristics of the display of a block level element, which a unordered list is to cause hardline breaks and some space above and beneath them. So we're going to style this menu as an unordered list, but we're also going to override its normal nature and cause it to display inline. And I'm hoping that this will help that concept grab on a little bit more. I will tell you that we are about to run into a new bit of difficulty with a new CSS rule, which basically defines what's called position. Position relative and position absolute. There are multiple positions, not just relative and absolute. There's static, there's fixed, etc. But relative and absolute are probably the two most commonly used, and they can be I make no pretense, they are still for me hard to grasp mentally. I frequently break things and then go, oh, I probably should have set that to position absolute or position relative, because I know how to watch them basically break. When they do break, I typically know, oh, it's probably because I didn't set a position rule, and I go at it and voila, it works. And we'll talk about the description of positions here on the W3C again in just a second. So with that, let's jump back over to Edit Plus. We're going to look now at the next index file in the sequence, which is index 5. So we have this new div ID, header 2. We had the div there before, but we didn't have any of the actual content between it. So the new stuff in this section is right here. You'll see that we've got a div with a class of content. Remember we talked about classes. You can use class names more than once. So we've got a div with a class of content, and in the previous section we also had a div with a class of content. We've got a div with an ID of logo. This is positioning the logo image. The logo image is not being called out in CSS. It's being added straight to the actual HTML of the page. Again, this is important to note that it is not only possible to display images either via either CSS and or HTML built into the HTML document itself, but there are times when it's technically right or wrong to do so. Most of your on-page, like real content, typically is hard-coded into the HTML. Most of the background stuff is typically done through CSS. Now, you say, okay, well, what about the icon images that we just talked about? The icon images could have been added either way. I could have added them straight into the HTML, or I could have added them basically the way I did through CSS. Because we're going to repeat or reuse that header content on every page, I decided to add it through the CSS. It was just a subjective decision on my part. It wouldn't have been technically right or wrong to do so. But like the images that are going to come on the content later on, all of those, they should be actually added to your HTML, again, with the understanding that if you add an image to your HTML document, you have the ability to, and of course, if you want your pages to validate, you have the responsibility to add, at minimum, at least alt text, which is happening because of the alt attribute. If you add images to your page via CSS, you don't have that ability. So the ability to improve your on-page SEO and to get, and this is something that maybe you don't know, one of my clients has an e-commerce website, and a lot of her traffic, surprisingly, not a lot, a significant amount though, actually comes to her site, because we track it, through Google Images. So someone will actually go to Google Images, do a search on a particular image name, and actually end up being website traffic for her, straight through the fact that she has her images indexed. This is happening as a result of having the images basically embedded into the HTML, much more so than having them shown in the background via CSS. It's not that it's impossible to have the others indexed, it's just more prevalent that the search engines, or Google in this case, is pulling them from the images that are actually shown on the page inside of your HTML document. Okay, so we've got this new div with an ID of header 2, which is controlling that entire area with the logo, the tagline, and the menu navigation. Like I said, we've got a div with an ID of logo that obviously is positioning that particular logo image. And the other thing to note is that it is linked. So instead of just seeing the image itself, which would still display fine, you'll notice that the image is wrapped in, if I start here to here, it's wrapped in the A tag. So this is how images are linked. You start off the exact same way as you would have before, but this time instead of contextual content coming here, instead of this saying my website logo, there is the HTML structure to show an image. Whatever is between basically the opening and closing A tag is going to be linked to whatever is basically shown in the href. In this case, we have it linked to index.html such that if anyone were to ever click the logo image, it would automatically take them back to the home page. This is very typical of most websites and most WordPress themes as well. So we'll go take a look at the CSS for all of this, the header 2, the class of content, the div ID of logo. The next is the tagline, a div with an ID of tagline. This is the raw text that's being shown on the page. And then next we have the actual navigational menu. You see that we've got a new div with an ID of access. Again, the name is unimportant. This could be a div with an ID of navigation, whatever you happen to like. Inside of that div now, we've got a div with a class of menu. And then, as I said just a minute ago, we are styling the main menu navigation as an unordered list. So we've opened it with a UL unordered list tag. It's closed down here. And the individual menu areas are being styled basically through each individual list item. So in this case, we have a list item. And then again, you see the A tag, a specific href, or where it's supposed to go, and you'll see a bit of text. What is actually being shown on the page: home, about us, services, etc. This is another reason why I really like Edit Plus and other full-featured text editors. HTML editors like this, actually they call them XML editors, because all this black text that you see, Edit Plus is telling us that is the actual content that's being shown to the visitor live on the page. So we'll talk about this also, because you'll see that each one of these pieces of text are entirely lowercase, but yet on the site they're displayed as all uppercase, and we'll show you how that was accomplished through CSS. So let's take a look at everything that's going on here via CSS. We'll scroll down now. We're going to look at the next area for header 2. Okay, so for header 2, remember that we are using a background image, that black granite looking image. So styling that entire container area is this fixed width background image. And actually, I think I must have changed the CSS. I had this set to repeat X. again, with the understanding that background images, the CSS attempts to tile it or repeat it left to right and top to bottom. You might wonder, well, if I didn't set it, why wasn't it causing it to be weird? And the reason is that the height value for this container was set to the exact same height as the height of the image. Let me show you that real quick. It should work. One of the difficulties with doing this is because of the cascading effect, the fact that sometimes this is something else that you need to know as someone that might be newer to CSS. Sometimes you might change a value and it actually doesn't affect anything on the page and you wonder why. And it might be because there's a different CSS rule set somewhere else on the page that is actually is already set to control it unless you overwrite it. So it gets a little bit challenging sometimes when you make a change and you see nothing happen. You say, oh, I don't understand. Something should have changed, yet it didn't. Let's set this height to 265 pixels, which we know is higher than the actual image itself. Actually, yeah. And more than likely what we're going to see, unless something's weird, we're going to see that the header area grows, and we do. We see it start to repeat. And the reason it's repeating, because I've allowed that container area to be taller than the actual image, it's now trying to repeat the image left and right and top and bottom. Well, it can't really show you left and right because the image itself is 1920 pixels wide, and the monitor that I'm displaying this to you on is only 1600 pixels wide. So even though it is repeating left and right, you can't see it. However, because the container area now is larger than the image itself, you're seeing it start to try to repeat the image, and it's repeating it top to bottom. You can see that we get this light colored line at the top, and then it's starting again. So the first thing we want to do is, that just gives you an understanding as to why the height was set to the same value as the image height. The next thing is, though, that I do actually want to set repeat X. I think I changed this in the other document and I forgot to change it in this one. But the reason this is, again, this will almost never ever actually show for anybody because most normal monitors are a maximum of 1920 pixels in width. I'm only doing this because in the event that someone were to call up my website on a big, flat screen TV that's huge, if their resolution was set wider than 1920 pixels, it would actually cause that image to repeat horizontally and at least fill whatever the size of their window was. Again, it might not look super beautiful, but it's a lot better than the actual image just stopping and then having basically blank space left to right. So that's the only thing that's doing. The next, again, is the class of content that is inside the div with an ID of header 2, and we're basically doing exactly what we did before to the earlier header 1. We've set the width to the same, 970 pixels. We're causing it to be centered again with margin 0 auto. But here's the new thing, position relative. And this is the thing that I said it's very, very hard for me to define. So we're just going to have to break it, play around with it, and hope that helps. If it doesn't explain it, at least give you some understanding when things go wrong as to one of the things that you might want to look at. So again, by default, the divs are set to a position of static. So commenting this out, in effect, is basically resetting the position value to static because that's its default characteristic. If we go look now as to what's going to happen, well, first off, this extra space is going to kind of go away, but the layout's going to mess up. And this is what we're going to see. And isn't that lovely? The answer is no. Well, again, this is very hard for me to explain, but we'll just kind of play with it. So realistically, if you start seeing things that aren't lining up the way that you want, I guess is my point in this is you might want to consider adding a position value, a new position rule, and trying either relative or absolute to see what happens. Well, I know that it should be relative, but let's change it to absolute and take a look at what that does. So by default, the div is styled as position static. It's now position absolute. All right, well, you see what that happened. That basically keeps everything intact. It's just it took it out of the div container area. It forced it over to the left. Putting it back now to position relative is what it needs to be. And this puts it back here. What did I do? I did something crazy. Jerry, do you see my mistake? Why did I lose my header image?
I did not see.
I'm going to set this back to this way just for a second. Okay. All right, I'll have to look into this. I'm not sure why that's happening, but I got rid of repeat X and the image is back and everything is the way it's supposed to be. Okay, let's just get back and talk about positioning. Go back to W3 Schools again, and again, like I said, it's easy just to do a quick search on the positioning property. So again, like I said down here, it says the one value is static, and you'll see the very last part, it says this is the default, which is what I just basically said. The other possible values for display, I'm sorry, for position, is absolute, fixed, relative, or inherit. Inherit, by the way, if you look up here, you'll notice that IE7 and earlier don't support inherit. So if you ever try to use it, just know that if you care at all about IE7 users, it's going to break stuff. Again, probably the best understanding is going to come from you looking at these play it things as well as the try it yourself. I will look at the play it's for you just so that we can try to make a little bit more sense of it. Again, this is something that even I really just kind of do by feel. I kind of see things break and I know, oh, that's probably a positioning problem, and I start setting things to relative, and no, that wasn't it. Set it to absolute. Hey, bingo, that's what I want. I know that that's not some amazingly, you don't think of me amazingly spectacular at the moment for saying that, but that's just the honest truth. Here's the reading of the text for absolute. It says the element is positioned relative, and I have to love that because down here we're talking about relative, and the first thing that says for the absolute is it's positioned relative, and you have to start scratching your head. What? I thought this was absolute. Well, it's positioned relative to its first positioned, not static ancestor element. So basically what it's saying is the element that's come before it, the next, when it's labeled as absolute, the ancestor element is affecting it as well. In relative, it says the element is positioned relative to its normal position. So in other words, if you added left 20, which we haven't really talked about just using left, we've talked about margin left and padding left. We haven't talked about left. This is a positioning thing, not adding space, but actually moving something either 20 pixels to the left or 100 pixels from the top, which also can be done with margin and padding, but this is just a positioning thing. Left 20 basically adds 20 pixels to the element's left position. Again, I don't think that I'm qualified to explain to you verbally the intricacies of positioning, relative, and absolute. Jerry, do you feel more confident on that? Otherwise, I just have to kind of show it to you visually as opposed to describe it verbally.
No, it's one of those things that you just do.
Okay.
I don't know how to explain it well either. I mean, I think once you see it, it's one of the things you see, you understand.
So if you look at these playets over here, I don't feel quite so dumb because Jerry's really smart. This is a really great tool, and it certainly helped me just to wrap my mind around it. The position for CSS property, you'll see that there's 4 radio buttons here. Currently it's absolute, and you'll see that this red square over here that has the words my div in it is positioned over here. This is the CSS basically that they've written that's controlling it. They've given the division with an area of 100 pixels in width, 100 pixels in height. So basically they've got a square. They gave it a red background, which is why it's red. They added left 10 and top 100, which means basically they're moving the element over 10 pixels from the left and 100 pixels down from the top of something. Right at the moment, they have the position set to absolute. Of course, we're not seeing the rest of the HTML, which is kind of a bummer, to see what this basically lives inside, what its ancestor elements are. But by default, again, positioning is set to static. And if I do that, you'll see that the box now jumps over here. So this HTML basically is inside of this particular div that's causing this white box to be output. If we set it to fixed, it goes back and, well, guess what? That looks exactly like position absolute. And if it's relative, now it's down here. Well, okay, well, what's this mean? Well, this means that this is relative to this other container. It's 10 pixels over from it and 100 pixels down from it, as opposed to the overall document itself. When it's set to absolute, it's basically saying ignore the div that this thing's wrapped in and position it just based on the actual 0 point of the website itself. Again, 10 pixels over, 100 pixels down. I'm hoping that this helps, and your ability to play around with stuff over here is going to help you get a better understanding. Going back to our document now, what we want is we want this area to be relative to the overall container. We want it to be moved over and pushed down relative to what it's living inside of, not relative to, or basically not taking it out of that understanding and allowing it to go back to the 0 point of the browser itself. If I went back and I set it to absolute again with this last bit before we move along, you'll see that no longer will it stay in this position. It's going to position it with as part of the CSS. It's going to position it now at the 0 point of the browser, not basically starting from a frame of reference of the division that it is housed inside. And that's the best way that I can explain it. So positions, relative and absolute, they will come up for you quite a bit when you're styling divs. Again, if you start seeing that, hey, I don't understand, I told it to be like in this instance, you'll see that I've given I'm using top to move the logo down by 50 pixels, and you'll see that we're using similar positionings of the tagline. Well, that positioning of the top 50 pixels is being controlled. Well, it's being controlled on the logo specifically here, but the entire div is being controlled by the position relative here. Let's talk about, you'll notice now we've got the opposite happening for the division of logo. We're styling it as absolute. and we're styling the tagline as absolute. Again, I don't think I'm going to be able to define it. You just have to play around with it and understand what happens when I set it to relative, watch stuff break, and then understand that if relative breaks, absolute is probably the setting that you're going to want to move to, and vice versa. Tagline. The tagline, we're setting a particular color for the tagline, a light gray. We're causing the font size to be a particular size of 20 pixels. We set a font style of italic, which is the first time we've done that. So with the understanding, this bit of text is actually a light gray, it's not white, and it is italicized, not through HTML. We could have done that. We could have wrapped the tagline in an actual iTag, but because we're setting it through CSS, it's always going to be that way, and it's really best if you're building a WordPress theme. Obviously, you don't want to have your user go into the HTML and change. If they don't want it to be italicized, you actually have to go in and change the HTML. Just one value setting inside of the CSS globally changes it for the tagline across everything. So again, in this case, we are telling it to basically move left or move to the right from the left 5 pixels and move or basically move the positioning from the top down 110 pixels. This is why the tagline is positioned here underneath the logo. If we were, and I guess we didn't spend, we have the logo pushed down 50 pixels from the top, and obviously the logo image has a height to it, and if that were to change, you would want to move your tagline positioning as well. We're moving it from the left, which is kind of gets confusing sometimes. We're not moving it left 5 pixels, we're moving it from the left 5 pixels, and if I cause this to be, I don't know, 25 pixels so you can see it, we'll see that the tagline now jumps further to the right. It's this left 5 pixels that's just moving the tagline just ever so slightly in. If I remove that that rule altogether, that property in value altogether, it's going to be very minimal, but you're going to see that the tagline is flush left with the container, and in my opinion it just looked a little bit weird, probably because the words demo logo are italicized and have a slant to them. So I just made a subjective call that I wanted to move the tagline in 5 pixels in order to have it, in my opinion, just look a little bit better. That's just subjective. It's now kind of aligned to the bottom corner of the D as opposed to the top, which is inset. Next, we talk about the links. Again, we're styling them inline rather than the default block level element that the unordered list is. We've got a blue color on hover, and again, as I mentioned before, in the HTML, when you look at the actual words, you'll notice that I've typed them all lowercase. I did that on purpose just so you could watch this new bit of CSS work. If we come down now and look at the menu, we have a division with an ID of access. We're styling the font size 18 pixels, and here's the bit of CSS that's controlling the uppercase. We have text hyphen transform. Text transform basically says whatever text is found inside of the div with an ID of access to transform it, regardless of what it is, to uppercase. So this is something that you just need to know, because you can get really confused or frustrated if you don't understand that this is a value inside of CSS. If you go back to your document, we're working at index 5, you say, I don't understand, I don't want those. I want it to show up this way. I want a capital H and I want a lower, case OME. As soon as I go back and show you the site, you'll see that nothing has changed. Everything is uppercase. The reason again is because the CSS is transforming whatever I've typed in HTML, it's transforming it into uppercase. If I were to conversely switch this, type the first home in all uppercase, and you could even mix it. We can even do that. There's the first three uppercase and a lowercase e. It still doesn't matter. It will display exactly as I want it to display. Conversely, if you wanted to set that value instead of uppercase to lowercase, that's frequently used as well in certain instances. Now everything is going to be lowercase. Even the first one that we know, I typed the first three letters in uppercase and the last letter in lower. So just something to pay attention to if you're trying to change stuff in the HTML and it's not actually rendering for you. It's quite possible that the CSS is overriding what you're doing in the HTML. Okay, so as far as the positioning of the menu is concerned, now instead of using a float right, we're using just the right value. Again, with the understanding that what this is saying is position this from the right, move it over 0 pixels or 0 anything, which basically means make it hard to the right. Could have done this with a float as well, just decided to show you something different. The next is, well, where are those links showing up relative to the overall container? They're here. They are 115 pixels down from the top, and that's what the top statement says. If I wanted them higher, moving that value is then going to mess with the height of those links independently of anything else, which is one of the cool things that divs give you the ability to do. Again, putting it back where we were at 115. The next is we are styling list items, which each one of those nav links is a list item, inside of an unordered list, inside of an ID of access. We want to display them in line. This is why they're all showing up on one line as opposed to their default vertically stacked. Again, if you don't add this line to your menu, if I comment that out, we're going to see this. We see a vertical stack, and of course some of these you can't see because it's white text over a white background, but you get the idea. This is the default characteristics of an unordered list. In order to change its default property, or the way it conducts itself naturally, we set it to display inline. And that puts it back to the way we want it. All right, going back to the CSS document, what else are we doing? Well, anytime we find the A tag or the link, we want links to be colored white. If anybody hovers over them, this is that pseudo element, A:hover. Any user hovers their cursor over a tag that's inside of a list item, that's inside of an unordered list, that's inside of the access ID, I want you to color it with this hexadecimal value, which is the blue that's showing. And this last bit says, and I don't have the ability to show you this live because we don't have any other pages, but if the link was active, this is again another pseudo rule, A:active. If the list is active, meaning I click on the link and I visit this other page, if the link is active, also keep it blue. So that's what's basically controlling this area right here. The only other thing I'll point out before we move on to the next section, and I can already tell that there's no way we're going to get through all of this tonight. I'll just have to do my best, cover as much as possible. We'll take questions, and probably I'll just make a follow-up video that just kind of covers the other content. There's just too much. But you might wonder, well, why aren't these links underlined? Because typically by default, it's another characteristic of links. Anytime that you put an A tag, you're going to have an underlined link. Well, why is that not happening? If we go back and look at the CSS, you don't see that I've stated that. Typically, it would be stated here when you're styling links. You would say text-decoration set to none. So why isn't it happening? I haven't set text decoration number, the text decoration property to none. Why aren't we getting underlines? The reason that is because way up higher in the CSS, I've styled every single link on the page, unless it's told differently, the A tag itself, all links to have a text decoration of none. This basically demonstrates to you the cascading effect of CSS. Because I have set every single link, because I'm styling the A tag with a text decoration of none, no links on the page will ever get an underline, which the text decoration, that's what it's referring to. So the question then is, well, since I want to give you an understanding of the cascade effect of CSS, what if I do want a link that's underlined? Well, the answer to that is you can set it individually. Up above, we set it globally. Unless you find something more specific, turn off all of the underlines for the A tag or for links. If I now decide that, oh, I want this underlined, I can set the text transformation, nope, text decoration, helps if you get the right property, to underline. So because now I have set text decoration to underline for this A tag, inside of list items, inside of unordered lists, anytime it's inside of the access ID, when we go back to the page, we will now see that when I refresh, we're going to get links on this area alone. We're still not going to get underlines on these by default. When I refresh, by default, now all of these are underlined, but these are not. And the reason that is that globally, these links are told not to have an underline unless hovered on, and these were told to be just blue. So that's that. Yeah.
What happened to the list bullets if it's a line item?
What happened to the list bullets? Why are there no list bullets? That's the exact same thing as we just showed in regards to the fact that the default state wasn't showing the underlines. If we go look at right here, line 28, we'll see that we've set ordered lists, so numbered lists, and unordered lists to a list style of none. You also see the list style is what's referred to as CSS shorthand. I could have also, since I'm not really doing anything else, I could set this to list style type. Remembering that the list style type is basically what's controlling. By default, it wants the filled in circles, which are called disk. You can set it to square, you can set it to circle. So if I were to set this now to square, up here globally, we've now said all unordered lists or ordered lists, unless told differently, should have squared bulleted items. And that didn't change. Let's see, am I looking at the thing right? I might be overwriting it somewhere else, which is basically what I was talking about earlier in CSS. You have to pay attention to that, because if you expect, you're going to get an underline, you expect you're going to get a bullet and you don't get it, it might not be that you've done anything wrong in that particular segment of CSS. It might be that something else is overriding it, and I'd have to spend a little bit of time looking at it. But the reason, to answer Jerry's question, that we didn't get bullets is because globally we've set all of the unordered lists and the and the ordered list to have a list style of none. Basically, don't display any type of a bulleted image. Okay. I think what we're going to do is we're going to just hit the next section, which starts basically populating most of the site content. And that looks like this. There's a lot going on in this segment. We probably won't get to the footer area, but at least we'll do our best to cover this right now. So in this area now, basically what's happened, we have a full content area, but you can see that we've broken it up into a left-hand area with the main content, and we have a right-hand sidebar. So that's really the main crux of what I want to get to you in regards to layout of this area is how to understand how that's accomplished. And it's accomplished through a similar thing that we did earlier in header 1 when we floated this div to the right. It's basically what we're doing here is we're using floats. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk a little bit about styling of these images, how this one is on the left, this one's on the right. Also, you'll notice that these images have a gray border around them. If I right-click and view image, you'll see that there is no gray border around the actual image. The image, the border is basically being added to the image dynamically via CSS. And if I added any new image to this page, automatically it would get that particular border treatment. So that's what's going on there. And in addition to that, the only other thing that we really have going on in this area is this testimonial area. And again, like I said on prior session, this could have been done via CSS with using a border radius, but this is actually an image. So there is a fixed top piece of an image, a repeating middle image, and a fixed bottom image, exactly the same way that we built this big main container image with the fixed top image, the repeated thin slice, and then the fixed bottom image. It's happening the exact same way. The only addition to that is we have another image basically sitting over top of it that has this nice looking quotation mark. So we'll just kind of jump into the HTML, break those things down, and then probably we'll take questions from there. And I'll probably have to come back with like a follow-up video and kind of go over the footer content. So let's see, back to Edit Plus we go. We're now looking at index 6 for your reference is where we add now all of the new content. You're looking at, for me on Edit Plus at the moment, it's line 58 is where the main body comes into play. You'll see that we're using another div with a class of content. If you recall, the div with the class of BG top, all this is doing is causing that fixed, the fixed white background image to show up. Again, it's causing this image, which is hard to see. This image right here is being displayed to the viewer because of the CSS that's controlling div class BG top. This div class BG mid is what's controlling that repeating image to start, and then underneath it we have div with an ID of main, and then we get to our actual on-page content. So we're really mostly looking for, starting the CSS, looking for the div with an ID of main. We have on-page content, again, being defined through HTML. We have a heading 1 saying to the browser, this is our most important piece of text. We have a paragraph. We have more paragraphs with these embedded images. You'll notice inside of the image now we have a new attribute over here, this one with a class of left and the other with a class of right. It's that class of left and class of right that is helping us position those images either to the left or to the right of the content. Note that the image actually comes before any of the content. So you might think, so I'm going to put a space here so you can see that a little bit more easily. You might think, well, I don't understand, why does this image not come to the left? Because the content is obviously after it. And the reason that is for this image is because of the CSS that's controlling it that says to force it over to the right. We'll see that here in a second. So, yes.
Yeah, it's CSS. The right isn't a command. It's just looking at CSS.
Yeah, someone had that question?
No, but I've had it asked before.
Okay, so yeah, it's a good point. If you simply add class equals left or class equals right to your image, you're going to see that it does absolutely nothing. What this is again, it's a connection between this class and CSS that we've written that allows us to control. Basically, anytime you find an image with a class of left, here's what you're supposed to do. Anytime you find an image with a class of right, here's what you're supposed to do. And that's how it's able to allow us basically to control these images separately of each other, because of course they have different class values. But Jerry's right. Just adding class equals left or class equals right to an image isn't going to cause it to do anything if you don't have some corresponding CSS. Good point. Right here is the closing div tag for main. So if I scroll upward, what I'm trying to point out to you is this. Everything that comes between the div ID of main open and closing tags is that left-hand area of the content. Everything that comes after that is going to be the sidebar, which we have a div with an ID of sidebar. And we'll take a look at the sidebar div and show how that's styled. Of course, we have other things going on inside of it, but I'll ignore that for the moment. We have a number of unordered lists, basically. Now we get to this strange thing here, this strange line, which for me is on line 103, before we get to the div that's controlling the testimonial area. We talked about clearing before and what that means, and this is going to hopefully help define this for you a little bit better. I pointed out before that I actually had the clear value attached to a bit of CSS. It still is attached to CSS, by the way, just like before when we talked about just a second ago. Jerry made me point out class equals left and class equals right by itself doesn't do anything. Div class equals clear doesn't do anything either unless it has corresponding CSS, so I need to make mention. But what this is doing basically is saying this, and we'll see that as we go through the CSS. I can tell you that we have the div with an ID of main floated to the left. Basically allow this div to sit to the left and allow something else to float alongside it. And you'll see how that's done here in just a second. Whenever you have floated elements, again, just remember that as soon as you finish with your floated elements, you need to add a command for clear. Otherwise, everything that happens beneath it will continue to try to float. It gets lost. Again, floating is another one of those things that's just kind of hard to wrap your mind around until you start playing around with it a little bit. But when you float elements, you're taking them out of the normal document flow. And until you basically tell it to stop doing that, it will continue to try to take everything out of the flow, and it will mess everything up. And I'll show you that after we discuss a little bit more about the CSS for the main and the sidebar. So let's go to the CSS and start there. We'll go, actually, we scrolled way far up. I'm sorry, part of my window, just so you know, is obscured by the GoToWebinar panel, so I kind of have to wait for my scroll bar to appear before I can go faster. So let's see, we are there, and we are here. So we're inside of the main body area, or inside of the body area here, and you can see that the overall content area is set to 978 pixels, which kind of seems weird. We have the the container areas in the header set to 970. So the question might be, why 978? It kind of seems like a weird value. This was only really set this way because the image, which is right here, the background top, background bottom, and background mid, when we slice those out, they were specifically 978 pixels in width, those images. So that's why the content is set to that value, in case you were wondering. The first thing that we have is a content class inside a main body, and the only thing that's really interesting to note, other than the fact that we've set a width and we've told it basically to center through margin auto, zero auto, is that we've added a little bit of padding to the top, 20 pixels. So we're adding a little extra space basically right here at the top with the padding top value set to 20. And if we removed it, the content would move upward and not look quite as nice, in my opinion. Again, there's the class of BG top, which is all it's doing is outputting that top image. The BG mid is repeating the image, and I must have done something weird with my CSS because I had placed this in order to hopefully make this make more sense for you. I'll set it back. So the mid class is causing that image to repeat vertically in the y-axis, again with a minimum height of 500 pixels, even if there's no content there. And then we've got the last image that sets basically partially over the footer area is the BG bottom. The next area that we're looking at is the division with an ID of main, that left-hand content area. Now here's what you need to pay attention to. We've set a width of 630 pixels to that area. Because this is obviously smaller than the overall width that we have, that gives us the space basically to create that sidebar to the right of it. If this width wasn't set for the main area, we would have all sorts of problems, because without this width value, it's going to inherit the value of what comes before it, which we know that content right here, main body content, again, is set to 978. So without this width value, this wouldn't work. So that's a very important piece of this layout, is that width value for the main. We're setting padding, basically space inside of this div, zero top. Again, remember this works clockwise and it starts from the top. Top, right, bottom, left. So we have no extra padding on the top, 10 pixels on the right, 0 on the bottom, 25 pixels on the left. Here's what that means. So we've set this width, I think it was to 630. The top pixels was set to 0, meaning no extra space. The spacing of the H1 element was fine to give it this space. We're setting 10 pixels of extra space to the right, 0 to the bottom, and 25 pixels to the left. This extra spacing, or the spacing that's coming here, it's moving the text away from this image edge, is that last 25 pixels. A line height of 22 pixels is affecting basically all of the content on the page. Let me just show you what I don't think we've talked about line height before. If we have, I don't remember it. I'm going to set this to 35, even though it was set to 22, and just show you what that means. You're going to see that there's a lot more spacing is going to happen between each of these lines of text. And that's basically the effect that you get because of setting the line height. Of course, the line height is relative to the actual font on the page. So if you go back and look at, let's see if we've set a font size for this area, and I don't see that we have. So it's being attributed somewhere else. farther up into the CSS document where we've actually set a font, probably for the entire body or something. So 22 pixels is the line height, and that looks good to me. If you want a little more air between your lines, you can increase it. If you want a little less, you want a little bit tighter together, you can decrease it. Entirely up to you. It's this float left statement that's causing it's causing the ability for that sidebar to scooch up. Basically, scooch up is a technical term. Jerry will tell you that. To allow the sidebar to sit alongside of this main content is happening because we're telling this 630 pixel wide division or container to float to the left. If I comment out this one line, we'll see that it no longer happens. Yes, it's still left, and it still takes up the size that we told it to, but what happened to our sidebar? Our sidebar now sits down here because remember that divs are block level elements, and it's putting that space above and beneath, and it's putting that hard line break. In order for this sidebar, in order to move back into position, we have to float this div, the main div, and that's specifically obviously what we've done. Remember that I told you that we're automatically adding borders to images. Anytime an image is added inside of the main ID, you can see that we're giving it a 3-pixel solid line border that is a gray. And if you wanted to change that to some other value, if you wanted to remove it altogether, if you don't want any borders around your images, getting rid of this will immediately get rid of the border. Moving down to the sidebar CSS, which is right beneath it, you'll see that we are calling out a specific width again, which is important. Anytime that you're floating an element, make sure that you specify a width. In this case, we're floating it to the right. We're also adding padding to the right of 18 pixels. What this is doing is, let's see, I think I put it back, is giving us this bit of space between it and the container image. So if you wanted that increased, you would increase the padding value. Please note this is where math comes into play. You kind of have to do a little math to figure out, okay, what kind of area do I have to work with? We have 978 pixels, I think, is the entire container area. We're taking up 630 here, remembering that padding basically is adding to your areas. So we've got 25 pixels on the left, we have 10 on the right, etc. You kind of got to do all the math and make sure that your areas are falling specifically where you want. If you use more than you have available, sometimes you'll run into problems, is my point. Underneath the sidebar area, we have some additional styling for the individual list items. So let me just kind of point that out real quick. Let's go back to index 6 and we'll take a look. They basically just repeat, so we only have to look at one and you'll understand all of them. Inside of the div with an ID of sidebar is another div with a class of side widget. Of course, we talked about this before. We're not building a WordPress theme in this training. You're basically building a HTML and CSS web page, but with the understanding that I intend to build a WordPress theme around this design, you get the understanding of maybe why widget's used. Widget is obviously a term that's typically used in conjunction with WordPress. So this is a div with a class of side widget, and inside of that I've got a heading 4, and you'll see that I'm styling this with a class of widget heading, and then you see actual on-page text. So we have recent posts, and then there's the individual list items, and you see that these are wrapped in A tags, so they're links to the demo or dummy, non-existent hello world post, etc. This is an unordered list, basically a bulleted list. since we are not causing this to display inline, it is displaying vertically stacked, its default state. But again, like Jerry mentioned, we're not getting bullets because previously we showed you that we've turned the list type to none for all unordered and ordered lists, which is why we don't have any bullets next to these list items. So I guess the other thing is, let's just look at the styling for the side widget, the widget heading H4, and then whatever else is in this area that I've styled it with. Let's see, the side widget, all we're doing with it is we've added 10 pixels of padding top and bottom, giving it a little space between that area. The H4, the main heading, we've colored it a particular color, which is blue. We've set the font size specifically to 24 pixels, which is larger than our default font size. And then we've said to basically give it a border bottom, basically a border line of 1 pixels, a solid line in a particular gray color. And then, in addition to that, add an additional 7 pixels of padding to the top and bottom, but none to the left and right, which is why, if we look at this, we're getting 24 pixels in height, we're getting blue text, and this line that's being output underneath the heading 4 is happening dynamically because of the CSS. If I added another heading 4, immediately it would have an underline. I wouldn't have to do anything additional to it. I'd have to just style it as an H4 with that particular class, with a class of widget heading. The list items now inside of the side widget are, look at this, they're also given the exact same border bottom. So it says each list item that it finds to give it the same exact treatment as the widget, the heading 4 widget heading. So if we go over here again, this list item, it says as soon as you output this list item, cause this border bottom. As soon as you do this one, border bottom. This one, border bottom. And if I were to add, 22 more list items, each one of them would automatically get that line underneath because of the bottom border, the border bottom call out. Padding, again, it's adding 10 pixels of padding to the top and bottom of each list item. So it's basically keeping them away from each other, a particular space, giving it some breadth. If you wanted to change that, make it bigger or tighter, if I just change this value to 5 pixels, we're going to see that this becomes way too tight. You can do it. It just, it would work. I like 10 pixels better. But if we went to set this to 25, of course we would see that we have way too much. We get this. So that's the value as far as the padding top and bottom. Basically, we're using padding shorthand. First value, again, is controlling the top and bottom, and the second value is controlling the left and right, which is 0. Next, we've got this crazy long list. So here's, again, what's basically being said. Whenever you see the commas, it's saying to do this CSS to this, and to this, and to this, and to this. So anytime you find a class with sidebar and a pseudo a class of a:visited, a link that's been visited, do this. If you find any link, the a: link basically means any a link at all with a class of sidebar, also do this. Anytime that you find a side widget, or basically a link inside of a list item, inside of a class of side widget, also do this. And if you find any list item with a class of side widget, whether or not it's linked, do this. It sets the color to a medium gray, and it sets the font size to 18 pixels. And lastly, it says, okay, the only other thing that I want to change is what happens if someone hovers over a link. No longer do I want it to be this medium gray. I want it to be this color blue, and I do not want you to underline it. So therefore, set the text decoration to none. However, I will tell you, because we've set all links to none, quite honestly, this becomes extraneous code. I should be able to comment this out, and we should not, theoretically, we should not get any link, a line under the link rather, because we showed earlier that we removed globally the text or set the text decoration to none globally for all links unless told otherwise. And you can see, let's see here, and that's not, it's not highlight, it's not underlining them on default, but it is underlining them as I hover. So actually, I guess I did it right. I don't want any, I guess initially I didn't set the text decoration to none for hover state, just for the basic link. So text decoration to none on this basically is causing these links to not have a link, not have a line on hover. They just changed to blue. All right, we're already a couple minutes past time, but let's just talk about the styling of the testimonials, and then we'll take some questions and get on with our weekend. So going back to CSS, we have the testimonials area, and we first need to kind of look at it in HTML. And we need to discuss this div class of clear. So we talked about it, and I basically just told you that you need to clear floated elements after you're done floating. So we use the floated elements again to allow that sidebar area to sit up alongside the div with an ID of main. And now that we're done with that, we want to get out of that and go back to just regular content. So let's look at the div with a class of clear first. It's probably not in this area. We probably set it globally because that's typically what I do. And we'll go look for it real quick. And there it is. This is what's controlling it, is right here. Anything with a class of clear. You'll see that the property and value set for it is to clear both. And this is generally what's used by most web designers, web developers. You can individually clear left and individually clear right, and I showed you that in a previous statement, or you can clear both at once. So all this really is saying is, if inside of the HTML document, if you find anything with a class of clear, again, you know it's a class because of the period, what I want you to do is to clear both floats, clear both the left and the right. So regardless of whether you use left or right, as soon as you hit this HTML, it says do something with a class of clear, I want you to clear the floated elements. So all we've done by adding this div class of clear, we're not really causing a new container area. We're not trying to put content in it. This entire statement is housed right here, the opening and the closing div. But because the class equals clear, it knows to clear both floats. So what we want to do is, and I didn't do this initially, so I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to put HTML comments around this. Again, remember that HTML comments are formed differently than CSS comments. HTML comments start off with the angle bracket, the exclamation point, 2 hyphens. They end with 2 hyphens and an exclamation point. But you'll notice that when I added the HTML comment around it, that this area became green, again giving you a visual indication inside of Edit Plus that it's going to be ignored. So it's going to act as if we haven't cleared the floats. And this doesn't change all that much. Many times, actually it does. Many times it would change way dramatically and become very obvious for you. All that you'll notice now is that this top image rounded corner of the testimonial area is no longer there, and it's been pushed way up here. If you forget to clear floats, just know this: your document will do very weird things. And if you start seeing all sorts of strange things happening, and if you know that you've used floats, you've probably forgotten to clear your floats after you were finished using them. We're only using the floating just to cause this left-hand content to appear in the right-hand sidebar. So again, it's one of those things that's kind of hard to maybe define in words, but I'm hoping that you just understand that if you have floated elements, remember to clear them after you are basically finished. And again, we've only used the floating of the elements in order to cause this two-column layout, basically, if you can think of it that way. So go back to the HTML, and we're really only going to cover this bit right here, and then we'll take questions and call it a night. Div with an ID of testimonials is the first div container. Next, we have div class equals top. If you remember how we built the main container page, it's built identically to that. This div class equals top is only outputting the top part of that gray background behind the actual testimonial content. The same thing with div class of mid. It's causing the vertical repeater, that vertical image, to repeat vertically, causing the image to repeat vertically behind the testimonial content. And then down here, of course, we are outputting the final fixed image for the bottom of that container. What goes between it now is this other content. We have a span used with a class of quote, and all that's happening here is we are causing an image to be shown. That's that quotation mark image that's being shown over the top of this background area, basically. And then next is a new div class. I probably should have named this better. I got testimonials, plural, and testimonial. That can kind of make it hard sometimes. Typically, it's better if you use more diverse or unique stuff, so it makes it easier for you when you're looking through CSS. But we have a div class with a class of testimonial. We've got a paragraph, and then we have another span. In this case, it's a span with a class of by somebody. So let's just look at what's happening with the span class of quote, the div with the class of testimonial, and the span with the class of by. And we need to, again, I apologize, I need to speed up here. Get to the testimonials area. All right, so the entire div container area we're saying basically to be 820 pixels in width. This was determined by the slicing of that image. We sliced the image, that gray rounded circle, rounded corner area of the testimonials, and the fixed width of the image was 820 pixels, which is how that value was selected. We are centering it on the page again through margin 0 auto. And then next is, again, like I said, that class of top is outputting the top image with no repeat. The class of mid is outputting the middle thin slice with a repeat of Y. The bottom image is set to no repeat there. Next, we get a class of quote. And this is, we're using it as a span, but basically anytime you find anything with a class of quote that is also inside of a div or inside of a ID of testimonials, here's what I want you to do. I want you to add margin left of 10 pixels, add margin top of 9 pixels, and position it absolute. Again, here we go back to positioning of things. This now is outputting that quotation mark image, and you might wonder, well, why didn't you you style it through a background image. And the only reason I decided to do it this way basically is because we already have background images running behind it, and I want this to sit on top of it, so we hard-coded it to the HTML. So we have the span class of quote, and we have hard-coded the image into the HTML such that it will sit over top the background image, which is that gray rounded corner image that's sitting at the very back of things. So the only thing that the quote class is controlling is the positioning of it. Through margin, it's being moved down a particular amount and over a particular amount, which is why the image is sitting here, not lower, not further right, etc. Those values are controlling the spacing, basically moving it away from the image that's behind it in the background. We've got a class of testimonial, a paragraph, and a span with a class of by. So if we look at that, here's the class of testimonial. We're setting the color of the text to a really dark gray, setting the font size to 14 pixels. We're setting the padding now of the text. So again, starting from the top, moving clockwise, we have 12 pixels of padding to the top, 23 pixels of padding to the right, 6 pixels of padding to the left, and to the bottom, top, right, bottom, left, 60 pixels of padding to the left. If we go back and look at the live image again, you'll note that we need more padding on the left than anywhere else because, again, it starts all the way from here, and we've got to get past the on-page image, these quotation marks. So that 60 pixels of left padding is helping us basically get past the image and then adding a little bit more breadth such that we can read this area without any problems. And lastly is that class of by. So whenever we add the class of by, basically the attribute or the site, we're saying to use italicized text to cause the text to be bold and to float it to the right. So we're using a float again, and what we're doing basically is causing the text to show up over here as opposed to underneath. If we removed that one line, again, we can comment it out just to show you the difference. No longer is it on the right. Obviously, it moves back to its default position on the left. So maybe you like that better, and that's perfectly acceptable. It's entirely up to you. So Jerry, I think I was hoping to get through everything, but I just don't think that's possible. So I think we probably best cut it for tonight now, maybe take some questions, and then either you and I will have to just jump on and do a personal webinar, or I'll just create a video for it, something like that.